On the 18th of March 1980, a facility security clerk at a defense contractor in Northern Virginia reviewed the previous week's access control report. The report listed David H. Mercer, an engineering technician assigned to a classified program, entering through the South Badge reader at 7:42 a.m. The clerk was reconciling routine entries against the paper sign-in sheet kept at the front desk. The case would later be labeled internally as the badge mismatch. The electronic access record showed Mercer inside the building. The paper log for that same morning did not show his name. Under company security procedure, any unresolved discrepancy between an electronic badge entry and the physical sign-in sheet required a supervisor notation before the weekly reconciliation could be closed. Such notations were typically reviewed again during the next quarterly audit cycle. The clerk printed the line from the access control system and stapled it to the weekly reconciliation packet. The printed strip included Mercer's badge number, the south entrance location code, and the 7:42 a.m. timestamp drawn from the automated log. The paper sign-in sheet for March 18 carried other names in blue ink. Mercer's name was not among them. The clerk entered a brief note in a small bound notebook used for irregularities. The note listed the date, the badge number, and the phrase, "Sign-in not located." No interpretation was added. The notebook was part of routine practice. Minor inconsistencies appeared every few weeks, missed signatures, unreadable handwriting, occasionally a badge swipe that failed to register properly. In most cases, employees clarified the issue within a day or two. A forgotten signature could be corrected with a margin notation and initials. A malfunctioning reader would be flagged to maintenance. The process was procedural and repetitive. David Mercer had been with the contractor for 6 years. His badge access pattern was generally consistent. Weekday entries between 7:30 and 8 a.m., exit swipes near 5:15 p.m., occasional Saturday entries tied to approved overtime. The March 18 entry did not, by itself, suggest anything unusual in timing. It was the absence of his name on the desk log that required notation. The security office handled badge issues before the end-of-day close each Friday. By mid-afternoon that week, the clerk placed the reconciliation packet in the supervisor's inbox with a routing slip attached. The slip included a check mark beside "Employee clarification required." At that stage, the discrepancy carried only administrative weight. An unresolved entry could affect internal access records and, if repeated, might require a clearance status review. Files with open category questions were routinely revisited by supervisors during periodic compliance checks. Mercer's personnel file showed no prior access violations. His clearance was active. There were no documented reprimands. The supervisor initialed the routing slip and returned it to the clerk with a short instruction. Obtain written explanation. The clerk drafted a standard inquiry memo. It cited the 18th of March 1980 access entry at 7:42 a.m., referenced the missing signature on the front desk sheet, and requested clarification within 3 business days. The memo was placed in an interoffice envelope addressed to Mercer's department. At that point, the record consisted of 3 items: the printed access log line, the unsigned desk sheet, and the discrepancy note in the bound notebook. No conclusions were drawn. The weekly reconciliation remained open. In later summaries, investigators would note that the badge entry itself was accurate. The reader had functioned properly. There was no indication of equipment error in the maintenance log for that week. But on the 18th of March, 1980, the matter remained limited to a small procedural irregularity inside a suburban security office. The badge had worked. The paper had not reflected it. The supervisor's notation was pending. David Mercer lived 3 miles from the facility in a subdivision built in the late 1960s. County property records listed the purchase under his name and his wife's in 1976. The commute was short. On most weekdays, he left the house between 7:10 and 7:20 a.m., according to later neighborhood interviews conducted by federal agents. The drive typically took less than 15 minutes outside peak traffic. Mercer's badge history reflected that pattern. Access control summaries for January through early March, 1,980, showed consistent weekday morning entries at the South Reader, usually between 7:31 and 7:58. a.m. exit swipes clustered in the late afternoon. The data was not reviewed daily, It was generated automatically and stored unless pulled for reconciliation or audit. Inside the facility, Mercer worked in a program area that required active clearance but not continuous escort. His department handled component specifications and document revisions. Work orders moved through interoffice envelopes. Drafts were logged, marked, and returned along predictable lanes. The security office rarely had direct contact with his unit unless there was a badge issue or an upcoming reinvestigation cycle. At home, routine also appeared steady. Utility billing records, later obtained by investigators, showed typical seasonal variation. There were no abrupt changes in usage. Postal carriers interviewed years later described regular mail volume catalogs, bank statements, local newspapers, nothing that stood out at the time. The house next door had changed occupants in late 1979. County records reflected a rental arrangement managed through an out-of-state property firm. The new resident, a woman in her early 30s, moved in during November. No formal complaints or association notices were filed regarding the property. Neighbors would later describe ordinary suburban contact, brief conversations near mailboxes, shared remarks about yard maintenance, occasional assistance with trash bins after heavy wind. No written record captured those early interactions. They entered the case file only through interview summaries months later. Mercer's wife worked part-time at a local medical office. Her schedule rotated between morning and afternoon shifts. On mornings when she worked early, Mercer was often seen pulling out of the driveway alone. On afternoons when she returned later, the house remained unoccupied for several hours. These details appeared in agent notes but were not interpreted at that stage. At the facility, the security clerk maintained the discrepancy notebook on a shelf behind the desk. The March 18 entry remained one line among many. During the same week, the notebook also listed a smudged signature from another employee and a temporary badge issued to a visiting consultant. By March 21, the interoffice envelope containing the clarification memo had not yet been returned. The clerk checked the routing ledger. It showed delivery to Mercer's department at 10:12 a.m. on March 19, recorded by the mailroom stamp. No follow-up had been logged. Most discrepancies closed without escalation. Employees typically replied with short written explanations, missed signature, arrival through an alternate entrance, or oversight during a busy shift change. The security office filed the response behind the weekly reconciliation sheet and marked the notebook entry resolved. The March 18 badge mismatch remained open through the end of that week. In the Access Control Archive, Mercer's entries for March 19 and March 20 followed his normal pattern. Morning entry, afternoon exit, no anomalies. The system did not flag frequency changes, only failed reads or denied attempts. The neighbor next door was not yet connected to any record at the facility. There was no cross-reference in personnel files. No contact disclosure had been filed, though annual reporting forms required employees to list certain foreign associations or significant outside relationships. The reporting window for Mercer's next update was still months away. On paper, nothing in late March 1980 indicated more than a small administrative gap. The badge system recorded Mercer entering at 7:42 a.m. on March 18. The desk sheet did not reflect it. The clarification memo was pending. The reconciliation file stayed in the supervisor's inbox, awaiting response. On the 24th of March 1980, the security office received David Mercer's written response to the clarification memo. The interoffice envelope was date-stamped by the mailroom at 9:18 a.m. and placed in the clerk's incoming tray before noon. Mercer's explanation was brief. He wrote that he may have entered through the south door during a period of heavier-than-usual morning traffic and did not recall whether he signed the desk sheet. He stated that if he failed to sign in, it was unintentional. The supervisor reviewed the memo and attached it to the reconciliation packet. Under normal practice, a single oversight could be marked resolved with a notation. The clerk updated the discrepancy notebook with a short line. Employee states possible missed signature. The matter might have ended there. 2 days later, during a routine internal review of after-hours access categories, another entry drew attention. On March 18, the same date as the badge mismatch, Mercer's badge had been used again at 8:13 p.m. at the same South reader. The timestamp appeared in the automated system summary pulled for a different reconciliation lane. Evening access was not prohibited. Mercer's role occasionally required late document revisions. However, the overtime approval sheet for that week listed no evening authorization for March 18. Payroll records showed standard hours only. The clerk printed the 8:13 p.m. line and placed it alongside the earlier 7:42 a.m. entry. The two entries bookended a day for which the paper desk log contained no signature from Mercer at all. If he had forgotten to sign in that morning, the omission extended to the entire day's physical log. Under facility procedure, discrepancies involving after-hours entries required confirmation of supervisory approval. The clerk checked the overtime ledger stored in a gray filing cabinet behind the desk. March 18 showed no supervisor initials beside Mercer's name. A second note was added to the bound notebook. This time the clerk wrote, "Evening entry 2013, no OT record." The earlier explanation about a missed morning signature did not address the evening access. At this stage, the issue shifted from a single missing signature to a broader documentation question. The badge system showed two valid entries on March 18, 7:42 a.m. and 8:13 p.m. The paper records did not reflect his presence at either point. Payroll documentation did not show authorized overtime. The supervisor requested a meeting with Mercer. According to a summary memo prepared later, Mercer stated that he might have returned briefly in the evening to retrieve a folder he had forgotten. He said he did not remain long enough to record overtime and did not recall whether he notified his department head. The memo did not assign motive. It recorded the explanation and noted that retrieval of materials after hours required supervisor awareness under standard protocol. At the same time, a separate process was underway at the facility. In late March, security offices conducted periodic reviews of employees scheduled for upcoming clearance updates. Mercer's name appeared on a preliminary list for a routine reinvestigation cycle due the following year. No action was triggered by that listing alone. However, when the clerk assembled Mercer's file for internal reference, the March 18 entries were visible at the top of the reconciliation packet. The badge mismatch now included both a morning and evening component tied to the same date. The clerk did not speculate. The file contained objective items: 2 time-stamped badge entries, 1 absent desk signature, no recorded overtime authorization, and a short written explanation. By the end of March 1980, the notebook carried 2 lines under Mercer's name. The weekly reconciliation remained technically open, pending supervisory disposition. The badge had functioned twice on the same day. The paper trail had not matched either entry. In early April 1980, the facility security manager asked for a short supporting packet before deciding whether to mark the March 18 discrepancy resolved or refer it for additional review. The request was standard. When an access question involved after-hours entry without an overtime record, supervisors typically wanted the basic documents in one place. The security clerk assembled a thin file. The printed 7:42 a.m. and 8:13 p.m. access control lines, the front desk sign-in sheet for March 18, the overtime ledger page for that week, and Mercer's written response. Each item was clipped to a routing cover with the case label written in plain terms: the badge mismatch. A separate form was added to the packet, a clearance status check request. It did not suspend Mercer's clearance by itself. It was a procedural step that documented an unresolved access discrepancy for later reference. The request was routed through the company's internal security channel, not a federal system, and it was filed with other routine inquiries. On April 3, the clerk called Mercer's department administrator to confirm whether Mercer had been assigned late work on March 18. The call was logged in a desk phone message book used for security communications. The administrator said no late assignment was recorded. The administrator also said that if Mercer returned after hours to retrieve materials, he would normally be expected to notify his supervisor the next morning. The security manager then asked for one more item: the visitor and inquiry log maintained at the security window. The log was not a visitor book for the whole facility. It was a small, spiral-bound log used by the security office to document badge questions, escort requests, and after-hours access inquiries. Employees came to the window for routine problems: a badge that wouldn't scan, a request for a temporary pass, a question about what doors were active after 6 p.m. on April 4, the clerk located an entry from March 17, the day before the badge mismatch. It recorded Mercer's name and badge number and a short question written by the clerk, "After hours access, south entrance." The notation did not indicate wrongdoing. It simply showed that Mercer had asked how the south entrance reader behaved after normal shift hours and whether entry would be logged the same way. As a standalone entry, it was ordinary. Security offices answered similar questions daily, but when placed beside the March 18 after-hours badge use, it became relevant as a timing detail. The clerk photocopied the page and added it to the packet. By that point, the file contained a small set of documented items that pointed in the same direction. Mercer asked about after-hours access on March 17, then used his badge at 8:13 p.m. on March 18 without a recorded overtime authorization and without a desk log signature. He provided a written explanation that addressed the missing signature generally, then gave a separate verbal explanation for the evening entry that was not reflected in payroll paperwork. The security manager drafted an internal memo for the department head. The memo did not accuse Mercer of anything. It stated that the March 18 access discrepancy had not been fully reconciled and requested confirmation of any authorized after-hours work or retrieval activity. It also noted that repeated discrepancies of this type could require additional review under company security policy. The memo went into an inter-office envelope and was sent through the same mailroom channel. The clerk placed the packet into a manila folder and wrote the same label on the tab: Mercer badge mismatch. The consequences remained administrative, but they were now documented. The clearance status check request created a record that the mismatch existed. If the file stayed open, it could appear later during periodic compliance checks. In mid-April, the security manager received a short response from the department head. It stated that no after-hours work had been assigned for March 18 and that Mercer had not reported a retrieval visit the following day. The department head recommended that Mercer be reminded of sign-in requirements and after-hours notification protocols. The security manager did not close the file. Instead, the packet was forwarded to the company's internal investigative unit for a routine consult. The referral was made quietly, as these were, through standard routing. The clerk updated the notebook with one more line: referred for review internal. The badge mismatch was no longer a one-page reconciliation issue. It had become a small internal case file with multiple attachments, each one ordinary on its own. By late April 1980, David Mercer's file at the defense contractor in Northern Virginia still carried the same open question under security review: the badge mismatch on March 18 and why the records did not reconcile. The internal investigative unit did not treat it as a singular event. Their first step was to lay the documents out in the order they were created, not the order they were discovered. The weekly reconciliation packet came first, then the clearance status check request, then the photocopied inquiry log page from March 17, then the department head's response stating there had been no authorized after-hours assignment. In the investigative unit's work notes, the issue was described in functional terms. 2 valid badge entries existed on the same date, 7:42 a.m. and 8:13 p.m., with no matching front desk signature and no overtime authorization. Mercer's written memo addressed the missing sign-in generally. His later verbal explanation addressed the evening entry as a brief retrieval. Neither explanation created a record that could be independently verified through the normal lanes the company used. A routine follow-up step was to check whether Mercer's access history showed similar gaps. Investigators pulled a 3-month access summary and compared it to the same set of weekly desk sheets and overtime ledgers. Most days matched cleanly. A small number showed minor issues, illegible signatures, a desk sheet filed out of sequence, but those involved other employees and had been resolved with initials at the time. Mercer's pattern did not show repeated after-hours use without overtime. The March 18 evening entry remained the only late-night access point in that period. In ordinary review language, it was an outlier. The unit then moved lanes, away from access hardware and into compliance reporting. Mercer's personnel file contained annual security forms, including a standard section requiring disclosure of certain continuing outside contacts. The forms did not require employees to list every neighbor or casual social interaction. They did require reporting of relationships that could create a conflict with clearance obligations or trigger a follow-up interview during the next reinvestigation cycle. The midpoint shift in weight came from a document that did not originate in the access lane at all. A short update sheet prepared for upcoming reinvestigation scheduling. In the notes field, a prior reviewer had written a single line about Mercer's personal contact history based on an earlier questionnaire. The line was not new and did not accuse him of anything. It simply indicated that Mercer had reported a close association, outside work that had been reviewed and closed years earlier. When the investigative unit placed that note beside the March 1980 discrepancy packet, it changed how the file was handled. The badge mismatch was no longer treated as a self-contained clerical problem. It became part of a compliance question, whether Mercer's record-keeping and reporting habits aligned with the procedures expected of someone with access to classified material. The investigative unit drafted a short internal recommendation memo. It did not speculate about intent. It identified the record problem. There was no independent confirmation. Mercer was present at the facility on March 18, despite 2 badge entries, and there was no documentation supporting his stated reason for after-hours access. The memo also noted that the March 17 inquiry log entry showed Mercer asking about after-hours access the day before the mismatch date. A standard next step was a limited neighborhood verification done quietly and framed as routine. Investigators did not canvass the street broadly. They requested a basic contact check through internal security channels, whether any resident adjacent to Mercer's address had a known connection to the facility or a reason to appear in security reporting. The result was negative through company records. No adjacent resident appeared in the contractor's personnel index. That absence did not create proof of anything. It simply meant the company had no internal cross-reference that would explain unusual contact patterns as normal workplace overlap. At the end of April, the security manager issued a narrow procedural action. Mercer's department was instructed to ensure Mercer completed a short refresher on after-hours access notification and sign-in compliance. That action was documented as a training acknowledgement form, signed and dated, and placed in the same folder as the badge mismatch packet. One sentence in the investigative unit's notes summarized where the file stood at that point. 3 different record lanes, access logs, payroll authorization, and security reporting failed to converge on a single, documented explanation for March 18. Nothing in those notes claimed motive. The records did not say why Mercer entered at 8:13 p.m., only that his badge did, and that the usual paperwork did not follow. The file remained open, and it was now positioned for referral beyond the company if the next checks produced another unreconciled result. In early May 1980, the defense contractor's internal investigative unit completed its limited review and forwarded a summary through its established liaison channel. The routing slip identified the receiving office as the local field division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The referral did not allege espionage. It stated that an unresolved access discrepancy involving a cleared employee had intersected with compliance reporting questions and required external awareness under standard protocol. The summary packet included copies of the March 18 access control entries at 7:42 a.m. and 8:13 p.m., the unsigned desk sheet, the overtime ledger page, Mercer's written explanation, the March 17 inquiry log entry, and the training acknowledgement form he had signed in late April. Each page was labeled and numbered. The case identity phrase appeared on the cover sheet. The badge mismatch. An acknowledgement memo from the FBI field office was logged by the company on May 9. The memo did not describe investigative steps. It confirmed receipt of the materials and assigned a reference number. From that point forward, documentation expanded beyond the contractor's internal files. According to later federal summaries, agents began with routine verification. They confirmed Mercer's employment status, clearance level, and access scope. They compared the contractor's access logs with their own understanding of standard facility procedure. No immediate enforcement action was taken. The first independent check involved telephone toll records obtained through legal process. The records were summarized in an investigative report rather than reproduced in full. The summary indicated several calls placed from Mercer's home phone in March and April, 1,980 to a number registered within the same suburban exchange. The number corresponded to the house next door. On its own, that fact carried no presumption of wrongdoing. Neighbors called one another for ordinary reasons. The report did not characterize the content of the calls, only their frequency and clustering during daytime hours. Agents conducted interviews in sequence. Mercer was approached first in a non-custodial setting. According to the interview memorandum, he reiterated that he had returned to the facility briefly on March 18 to retrieve a folder and had not considered the visit significant enough to report as overtime. When asked about his relationship with the adjacent resident, he described it as friendly and limited to casual conversation. The neighbor was interviewed separately. The interview summary, prepared by the case agent, recorded that the neighbor acknowledged a closer personal relationship than Mercer had described. The summary did not include emotional language. It stated that the relationship had involved private meetings during hours when Mercer's wife was at work. The timeline in the interview notes intersected with the March 18 discrepancy. The neighbor stated that on at least one occasion in mid-March, Mercer had left his house in the evening and said he needed to check something at work. The summary did not quote exact dates beyond what the interviewee could confidently recall. It did not claim that classified materials were present at the residence. Agents then compared Mercer's access history against days when telephone records showed concentrated calls to the adjacent residence. A pattern did not emerge immediately. Most badge entries matched normal workdays. The March 18 date remained the primary anomaly, linking workplace and personal timelines. A further document check involved Mercer's annual security disclosure forms. Agents reviewed whether he had reported a significant outside relationship. The most recent form on file did not list the neighbor. Under reporting guidelines in place at the time, employees were required to disclose certain ongoing relationships that could affect clearance evaluation. Whether Mercer's association met that threshold became a point of documented analysis rather than assumption. In late May, the FBI requested consent to review materials inside Mercer's home office. According to a property receipt included later in court records, several notebooks, loose documents, and envelopes were collected for examination. The receipt listed items in neutral terms: engineering notes, correspondence, miscellaneous papers without characterizing content at that stage. The contractor was notified that federal review was active. Mercer's badge was temporarily deactivated pending outcome, a standard administrative hold when an external investigation intersected with access concerns. The deactivation was logged in the access control system with a status code indicating security review. By early June 1980, the case had moved beyond internal compliance. The badge mismatch, once a single-line entry in a bound notebook, was now one component in a federal counterintelligence file that combined access records, interview summaries, and seized materials. No arrest had been made. The records, however, were converging toward a decision point defined not by speculation, but by documented inconsistencies across multiple lanes. By midsummer 1980, David Mercer's case in Northern Virginia handled through the contractor's security office, and the FBI still centered on the same open record problem: the badge mismatch from March 18 and the unresolved after-hours entry. The contractor's administrative hold remained in place. Mercer's badge status in the access control system showed security review, and the deactivation date was entered as a control point for later audit. The security clerk kept the original reconciliation packet in a closed folder, now supplemented by copies of federal correspondence routed through the security manager's office in sealed envelopes. According to later federal filings, investigators spent June confirming whether the materials collected from Mercer's home office contained any controlled documents or extracts that should not have been outside approved storage. The analysis was described in inventory and lab request forms rather than narrative detail. Items were logged by category, tagged, and assigned to a chain of custody line. Some pieces were determined to be ordinary work-related notes. Others were flagged for closer review based on markings and content classification indicators. At the same time, agents returned to the March 18 question and treated it as a procedure problem with measurable constraints. If Mercer entered at 8:13 p.m. without overtime authorization, what explanation fit facility policy, and what documentation should exist if the visit was legitimate. The contractor provided a short policy extract covering after-hours retrieval and reporting requirements, along with a statement from the department head that Mercer had not reported any late return the next day. In early July, the FBI requested an additional set of records through formal process. The contractor produced archived desk sheets for March, maintenance notes for the south entrance reader, and the mailroom routing ledger showing when the initial clarification memo had been delivered and returned. None of those documents disproved Mercer's presence. They simply reinforced that the paper lane had not captured him on March 18, while the electronic lane had. Agents also re-interviewed the neighbor. The second interview memo focused on timing and contact frequency rather than characterization. It recorded that Mercer had visited next door during weekday afternoons and that the contact continued after his wife's work schedule began shifting into mornings. The memo stated that the neighbor had not been told the details of Mercer's work, and it did not claim that any documents had been shown. The purpose, as documented, was to reconcile discrepancies between Mercer's description of the relationship and the neighbor's account. By mid-July, the case file contained 3 sets of contradictions that were procedural rather than interpretive: the March 18 access record versus the desk sheet, the after-hours entry versus the overtime ledger and policy requirements, and Mercer's description of a limited neighbor relationship versus interview notes indicating a closer pattern of meetings. The decision to proceed toward enforcement was recorded as a supervisory step. A brief internal FBI summary recommended legal action based on documentation and review results, and the matter was referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for charging consideration. The referral itself did not appear in the contractor's files beyond a liaison notice indicating case progressed to legal review. On the 29th of July, 1980, a federal complaint and arrest warrant were issued, according to later court docket entries. The arrest did not occur at the facility. Agents approached Mercer at his residence during the late morning, after confirming through surveillance notes that he had returned from a short errand. The documentation described a standard process: identification, service of the warrant, and an advisement of rights. There was no mention of public disruption. A property receipt completed that day listed items taken into custody for evidentiary control, including Mercer's company ID badge and a small set of papers gathered from a desk drawer that had not been collected in the earlier consent review. Each item was described in plain terms, numbered, and signed for. An envelope containing the receipt copy was left at the residence. The contractor received notification through the security manager by the end of the day. Mercer's personnel status was changed from administrative hold to termination pending outcome, as documented in an internal HR security coordination memo. The security clerk added one final line to the bound notebook where the case had started months earlier. Federal Action Badge collected. In the weeks that followed, the contractor's security office closed its reconciliation lane as referred externally, but the folder remained active in a separate cabinet used for cases with legal status. The original March 18 access control strip was still stapled to the first page. The file was orderly. The outcome, at that point, was not. The federal case against David Mercer moved through the court system during the fall of 1980. The docket reflected a series of scheduled appearances, motions, and status conferences. The charging documents summarized the government's position using the same categories that had appeared in earlier files: unauthorized retention of classified materials and failure to comply with reporting obligations attached to his clearance status. The March 18 access entries, 7:42 a.m. and 8:13 p.m., were cited in the affidavit supporting the complaint as timeline anchors. They were not presented as proof by themselves. They were described as the starting point of the internal review that led to document examination and further inquiry. The phrase "the badge mismatch" appeared in contractor memoranda attached as exhibits, establishing how the matter first surfaced. During pretrial proceedings, defense counsel did not dispute that Mercer had entered the facility after hours on March 18. The argument focused instead on intent and classification handling. Court transcripts later summarized the government's evidence as a combination of access records, seized documents bearing classification markings, and inconsistencies in Mercer's statements regarding reporting requirements. In December 1980, according to the court docket, Mercer entered a plea agreement. The agreement acknowledged unauthorized retention of certain classified materials and failure to adhere to security reporting standards. The court accepted the plea after a hearing in which the factual basis was read into the record. The reading referenced the March access logs, the Home Office inventory, and the reporting forms on file. Sentencing occurred in early 1981. The judgment imposed a term of incarceration followed by supervised release, along with a prohibition on future access to classified information. The written judgment specified conditions typical for federal cases of that category at the time. There was no public statement from the contractor beyond confirmation that Mercer's employment had been terminated following his arrest. The practical consequences extended beyond the sentence. Clearance revocation was entered into the relevant federal index, making Mercer ineligible for future classified work. Employment records reflected termination for cause. Pension contributions remained governed by the company's standard forfeiture and vesting policies, documented in HR correspondence exchanged with Mercer's counsel. County property records show that the suburban house was sold in 1982. The sale price and transfer date appear in the land registry without commentary. School enrollment data from the local district indicate that Mercer's child withdrew before the following academic year. These changes were recorded administratively, not narratively. The neighbor next door moved out within a year of the arrest. Rental filings list a new tenant by mid-1981. No court record suggested that the neighbor was charged with an offense in connection with Mercer's case. Interview memoranda describe the neighbor as a witness to timeline and relationship facts, not as a co-defendant. Years later, the contractor's security training materials referenced a case from 1980 involving an after-hours access discrepancy that led to federal action. The materials did not include Mercer's name in general presentations. They cited the importance of reconciling electronic badge entries with physical sign-in sheets and reporting significant outside relationships as required by clearance policy. In periodic clearance reviews across the industry, records from that period continued to appear in background checks. The revocation entry remained visible in federal indices long after the sentence had been completed. The administrative trace outlasted the criminal proceeding. The original bound notebook in the contractor's security office was eventually archived. The March 18 entry remained one line among many. Date, badge number, notation of a missing signature. Beneath it, added months later in different ink, was the final entry. Federal Action Badge collected. The documentation did not assign motive beyond what the plea established. It did not describe emotion. It recorded that a small procedural irregularity, an electronic entry without a matching signature, triggered a sequence of reviews across access control, compliance reporting, and federal investigation. The badge had functioned at 7:42 a.m. and again at 8:13 p.m. on the 18th of March 1980. The paper had not matched. The records accumulated from there.